It started with a sandwich. Not a metaphor. A real, literal, meat and cheese sandwich. Turkey, Swiss, a swipe of Dijon mustard, soft multigrain bread, not exactly gourmet, but solid, reliable, comforting. I'd made it the night before in a half-hearted attempt at meal prepping, which for me mostly meant remembering not to eat half the ingredients while assembling them. I even wrapped it in wax paper like I was starring in an aspirational YouTube lunch vlog. It was a good sandwich. Maybe even a great one. I labeled the bag with a Sharpie. Taylor, do not eat, like a polite but firm threat. Into the communal fridge it went. And I went about my morning Zoom meetings, spreadsheets, nodding at things I only half understood while secretly Googling acronyms people threw around like confetti. The usual. By noon, I was starving. I'd passed hungry 2 hours earlier and was well on my way to could punch a man over a saltine. I walked into the break room already fantasizing about that first bite, cheese just the right amount of softened, the bread slightly cool but not soggy, the mustard waking up my taste buds like a dependable old friend. But when I opened the fridge, my sandwich was gone. In its place was a damp, crumpled post-it note stuck to the shelf like a passive-aggressive tombstone. The ink had run from condensation, but I could make out the faint ghost of the word sorry and what might have once been a smiley face. Or maybe a frown. It was hard to tell. The paper looked like it had been through a minor flood. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where my lunch had been. There's a specific kind of helpless rage that comes from someone stealing your food. It's primal. I was half a second away from conducting forensic analysis on the shelves for fingerprints when I got a Slack notification. It was a message from my boss, Melinda. She'd posted in the company-wide general channel, a message so thinly veiled it may as well have been wearing fishnet. It was a general reminder to respect others' lunches, to label things properly, as if I hadn't, and to be mindful of community fridge etiquette. That emoji. That passive-aggressive, sunshine-smiling, corporate weapon of a punctuation mark. I could feel my blood pressure rise just looking at it. At first, I assumed it was just one of those harmless overreactions. A weird little blip in the day that would make a good happy hour story. We've all dealt with office fridge drama, the passive-aggressive labels, the person who brings tuna salad in a sealed Tupperware and still manages to gas the entire floor, the unspoken territorial battles over shelf space. I figured this was the same thing. A moment of weirdness. We'd all laugh, shrug, and move on. But that's not what happened. Because Melinda didn't laugh, or shrug, or move on. Over the next few days, things shifted. Subtly, at first. Her tone in emails changed from friendly and enthusiastic to clipped and vaguely managerial. Tasks that used to come with a thank you now came with phrases like, per my last note, and please advise. She started triple-checking my work, asking for updates on projects I'd already finished, then acting surprised when I reminded her she'd signed off. I chalked it up to stress. In a quarter chaos, maybe. She was a perfectionist, a little type A, but she'd always been warm, generous with praise, and oddly invested in my hydration habits. She once gifted me a reusable water bottle and said, "You can't do great work if your cells are dehydrated." I genuinely liked her. So I brushed it off until she brought up the sandwich incident again. Not to apologize. Not even to joke about it. But to say she was still concerned about how it was handled. I didn't know what that meant. Handled how? I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't even responded to the Slack message. I just quietly ate a sad protein bar and got back to work. But apparently, my energy had been disruptive. That's how she phrased it. Not behavior, not reaction energy. Like I had walked around radiating hostile sandwich lust, and it had somehow damaged the team's productivity. That word stuck with me. It was the kind of corporate language that sounds professional on the surface but is impossible to argue with. You can't defend yourself against energy. It's not measurable. It's not concrete. It's just a vague, spiritual accusation floating over your head like a bad horoscope. From there, things got weirder. She began referencing conversations we never had, telling me she'd given feedback in a meeting I didn't attend, or that she'd assigned a task I had no memory of. At one point, she told me I'd missed a deadline on a document she never actually sent me. When I checked my email, it wasn't there. When I asked her about it, she said she was pretty sure she'd sent it, and that I should really work on being more detail-oriented. I started feeling like I was in a glitchy video game where the NPCs were rewriting the script while I played. And I began to doubt myself in small but significant ways. Had she told me that in passing? Did I miss something? Was I too sensitive? Too reactive? Too hungry? That was the moment I realized this had nothing to do with a sandwich. Or maybe it had everything to do with it. Because it was never about the sandwich itself. It was about what it represented. A small, absurd injustice that cracked open something bigger. Something older. Something I wasn't ready to name yet, but would soon have no choice but to confront. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just stress. A few bad days. Maybe I was reading into things. People change tone all the time, especially in emails. Maybe Melinda was just under pressure. Maybe I was just too sensitive. Or tired. Or still bitter about the sandwich, which, I reminded myself sternly, was a minor blip in an otherwise decent professional relationship. But once you notice a shift, it's hard to unnotice. The tone of our interactions became colder. Conversations that used to be easy and conversational suddenly felt transactional. Her emails lost the extra exclamation points. No more, hey, intros. No more tiny smiley faces at the end of casual messages. Just short replies and an increasing reliance on phrases like, as stated earlier, and let's align offline. There was a strange stiffness to it all, like someone trying to create distance without saying why. Then came the feedback. Melinda started offering what she called proactive coaching, which in practice meant pointing out mistakes I hadn't made and offering suggestions for more effective tone in emails that were, as far as I could tell, perfectly neutral. She stopped complimenting my work. She started questioning how I prioritized tasks. She began referencing team concerns without naming anyone or anything specific. Every conversation left me wondering if I'd missed something crucial or worse, if she was seeing flaws in me I hadn't realized were there. Still, I kept working. I overcommunicated. I double-checked my deliverables. I asked for confirmation on small things, just to be safe. I tried to keep my tone breezy, upbeat, collaborative. I even started ending my own emails with "please let me know if I misunderstood anything," which in hindsight was less about clarity and more about fear. And I couldn't help but notice that none of this was happening to anyone else on the team. There was a junior associate who actually did miss deadlines, but Melinda still praised her for creative initiative. Another team member once mixed up 2 client accounts in a shared doc, and she waved it off with a laugh. It wasn't about mistakes. It was about me. And the worst part was, I still couldn't tell if I was imagining it. Because Melinda never yelled, never insulted me outright. She didn't raise her voice or roll her eyes or send snippy Slack messages. Everything she said was wrapped in careful HR-safe language, gentle nudges, tone observations, just trying to help comments. On paper, she still looked like a supportive manager. Maybe even a good one. But in practice, she made me feel like I was slowly unraveling. It was death by professionalism. This is the part of the story where I wish I could say I stood up for myself, that I scheduled a bold one and laid out all the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the way she had been slowly manipulating my sense of reality. But I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. I said, thank you for the feedback. I told myself that maybe I was being too reactive, that maybe this was how leadership looked behind the curtain. Maybe I just wasn't cut out for this kind of team. Maybe I was the problem. And that thought, maybe I'm the problem, dug in and started to rot. I stopped eating lunch in the break room. I stopped participating in the group Slack banner. I got quieter in meetings, afraid to say the wrong thing. Every message I sent was edited 3 times for tone. I started screenshotting things just in case. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I knew I was bracing for something. It all felt weirdly familiar. Uncomfortably so. In high school, I had a math teacher who did something similar. She never yelled or insulted me directly, but she had this way of undermining me in front of the class. If I got an answer wrong, she'd repeat it with exaggerated surprise. Really? That's what you think? And when I got it right, she'd ignore me completely. I spent that year questioning my intelligence. I convinced myself I was just bad at math, even though I'd been in honors classes since 6th grade. Years later, I realized what she'd been doing, isolating me. Not with cruelty, but with silence, subtlety, and strategic embarrassment. Melinda felt like a grown-up version of that. Only this time, the stakes were higher. I wasn't a teenager anymore. I couldn't just cry in the bathroom between periods and hope to graduate out of it. This was my job, my rent, my health insurance. I needed it to work. And I needed me to work, to function, to stay sharp, to stay sane. But when someone chips away at your reality with enough finesse, you don't break all at once. You erode slowly, quietly. You get good at gaslighting yourself before they even have to. I told myself it would pass, that I just had to be perfect for a little while. That if I kept my head down and delivered flawless work, she'd warm back up. Things would go back to normal. But perfection is a moving target when the rules keep changing. And Melinda, whether she knew it or not, was rewriting the rules as she went. The thing about people like Melinda is they rarely look like a problem at first. They look like mentors, cheerleaders, the ones who tell you how bright your future is and how lucky they are to have you on their team. They learn your strengths fast, and they learn your soft spots faster. That's what makes it so confusing when the dynamic turns. They don't suddenly become monsters. They just change the rules. And if you're like me, if you spent most of your life trying to make yourself safe by being liked, needed, or exceptional, you'll bend yourself into 1,000 shapes before you admit something is off. Because the alternative, that someone is messing with your reality, is scarier than the slow suffocation of self-doubt. I've been through something like this before. Just not at work. My mom was the original master of emotional contradictions. She could be radiant and affectionate, singing to me in the kitchen, cheering me on at school concerts, staying up late to help glue sequins onto a last-minute costume. And then, without warning, she could go cold, distant, withholding. She'd stare right through me when she was upset, make casual comments that cut deep, or go quiet for days as punishment for some minor infraction I couldn't even identify. When I'd try to bring it up, when I'd ask why she was mad, what I'd done, she'd act baffled. I'm not mad. You're being dramatic. Or worse, you're imagining things. You always do that. I learned quickly that it was safer to read the room than to ask questions. To over-apologize before I knew what I'd done wrong. To be useful, thoughtful, high-achieving, the kind of daughter who wouldn't give anyone a reason to leave. And I brought those habits into adulthood like packed luggage. In therapy, I'd started to recognize some of this. The hypervigilance. The compulsive self-blame. The way I could replay a single interaction 10 different ways in my head to figure out where I went wrong, even when I hadn't. But knowing something and undoing it are not the same thing. So when Melinda began subtly shifting our dynamic, I didn't call it what it was. Not yet. Instead, I adjusted. I started arriving earlier and staying later, even when no one asked me to. I reread emails 3 times before sending them. I kept a private document where I tracked every task, message, deadline, and meeting summary, just in case something came up later and I needed to prove I wasn't crazy. I was trying to out-perfect whatever narrative she was building around me. That's the thing about trauma, it doesn't always look dramatic on the outside. Sometimes it just looks like someone working themselves to death to avoid disappointing a person who's already decided to be disappointed. What made it especially confusing with Melinda was the occasional kindness. She'd still drop compliments now, and then praising a project in passing or telling me she appreciated my dedication. Once, she forwarded me an article about burnout with a little note. This made me think of you, in a good way. I remember feeling touched by that. Like maybe I'd imagined the distance. Maybe we were okay. That moment passed quickly. A few days later, she contradicted me in a team meeting in a way that made me look careless. She said we discussed something at length during a one-on-one, which we hadn't. I felt my face flush with heat as I scrambled to respond without sounding defensive. I smiled. I nodded. I took the note. And afterward, I went back to my desk and stared at my hands for a long time. The contradiction wasn't even the worst part. It was the way she said it so calmly, so casually, as if I was the one misremembering. It didn't feel malicious. It felt practiced. I started to wonder if she believed her own version of things, or if she just needed someone else to carry her mistakes. Either way, it left me in the same place, second-guessing myself, feeling smaller by the day, and desperately trying not to mess up something I no longer fully understood. That slow erosion, that's what really got to me. It wasn't one dramatic betrayal. It was 100 quiet moments that built up over time until I couldn't tell where she ended and my anxiety began. I knew something was off, but it didn't feel big enough to justify speaking up. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening me. She was just shifting sand beneath my feet. And I was too good at tiptoeing to notice how off balance I'd become. In retrospect, it's obvious. I wasn't reacting to Melinda as a manager. I was reacting to her as a stand-in for every authority figure I'd ever tried to please. Every emotionally unpredictable adult I'd learned to read like weather patterns. Every person who made me feel like stability was something I had to earn by being perfect, quiet, useful, small. She didn't cause that, but she tapped into it with uncanny precision. And I let her. Not because I was weak, but because for most of my life, survival meant keeping the peace, even when it meant disappearing inside someone else's narrative. That's what made this different from a normal bad boss story. It wasn't just about work. It was about the stories I told myself to stay safe. About the way unhealed things have a way of reappearing, shape-shifted, until you finally decide to face them head-on. And whether I was ready or not, that moment was coming. Tea wasn't the sandwich, or the weird tone shifts, or the gaslighting disguised as mentorship. It wasn't even the creeping sense that I was being slowly, methodically uninvited from my own professional competence. It was the spreadsheet, a document, something real, something I could point to, something that, for once, wasn't up for interpretation. We were putting together a quarterly client summary, a standard report, nothing especially complex, but enough moving parts to require a few check-ins. Melinda had said she'd send over a framework early in the week. I waited. I followed up once, then again. She didn't reply, which wasn't unusual by that point. So I made my best guess, filled in what I could, pulled clean data from the system, and submitted it with a brief summary. And then she called me out for doing it incorrectly. Her tone was firm but polite, calculated, even. She said I had missed the mark, that this wasn't what we discussed, that she had clearly outlined the format in an email on Tuesday. Except there was no Tuesday email. I checked. Then I checked again. Inbox. Spam. Deleted. Quarantine filter. Nothing. For a moment, I felt that familiar flutter of panic in my chest. The rush of self-doubt. Had I missed something? Had I opened it on my phone and accidentally deleted it? I've done that before. Fat-thumbed a swipe and watched a message disappear. Maybe that's what happened. So I asked myself the question I'd been trained to ask in every gray area interaction with authority. Is it possible that this is my fault? It was possible, but not probable, because this wasn't the first time she'd referenced an email that didn't exist, or a meeting that never happened, or a conversation where we had, allegedly, agreed on a decision I remembered differently, or not at all. I used to think these things were simple miscommunications. Now I wasn't so sure. I went home that night feeling like I was on the verge of something. Not a nervous breakdown, exactly, but a threshold of clarity I couldn't yet cross. I'd spent weeks chalking things up to stress and misalignment. I'd been generous in my interpretations, careful not to assume malice. I'd reminded myself that memories are flawed, that language is slippery, that we all experience moments differently. But eventually, the data adds up. When enough little lies pile on top of each other, they stop being individual misunderstandings and start forming a pattern, a system designed to make one person look disorganized, defensive, unstable. I'd seen this before. I'd lived it. And now I was watching it play out again in a new costume. Only this time, there were spreadsheets involved. I started drafting a list in my head, dates, times, examples. I opened a Word doc and typed out everything I could remember about the week. I pulled timestamps from Slack. I made a private folder. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but something in me needed the receipts. Not for HR. Not even for Melinda. For me. To remind myself I wasn't making this up. The next morning, Melinda sent a follow-up message looping in a member of HR. Just keeping everyone aligned, she wrote. Taylor and I have had some ongoing miscommunications, and I want to ensure we're all on the same page. There it was. Miscommunications. The safest possible accusation. Vague, blame neutral, impossible to disprove. It implied good intentions on both sides. It made everything sound like a minor hiccup rather than the slow, subtle dismantling of someone's credibility. And now HR was watching. I remember staring at my screen, hands frozen above the keyboard. I knew what this was. It wasn't about the spreadsheet. It was about control. And she was getting ahead of the story. For a split second, I almost replied with an apology. The muscle memory was that strong. I almost said, sorry for the confusion. I must have misunderstood, even though I knew I hadn't. Even though I had the timestamps, the messages, the absence of any Tuesday email. But I didn't send anything. I just sat there, letting the silence expand, letting the anger bloom. Because something was finally shifting not in her, but in me. Later that day, I recorded a voice memo while sitting in my car. Not to share, just to hear myself speak plainly. I recounted the whole week, from the missing email to the HR message, in one long, uninterrupted monologue. And then I played it back. It's strange. Hearing yourself describe a situation you've convinced yourself is ambiguous and realizing it's actually not. That it's clear. That it's wrong. That it's real. That voice memo was the beginning. A line in the sand. A private acknowledgement that I wasn't imagining this, that I had a right to the truth of my own experience, even if no one else believed it yet. And if Melinda was going to start documenting things, so was I. That weekend, I cleaned my apartment with a kind of manic focus. I scrubbed tile grout, cleaned under the fridge, organized my email folders. I told myself it was productive, that it was self-care. But really, I was preparing. Not for a confrontation, but for clarity. I knew what was happening now. Melinda wasn't just being difficult. She was managing her narrative, prepping her version of events, setting the stage for HR to see me as the issue, as the loose thread in an otherwise smooth operation. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even lying directly. She was playing a longer game, one where perception mattered more than facts, and quiet sabotage left no fingerprints. And I had finally decided I wasn't going to play along. I wish I could say there was a moment of cinematic clarity, that I slammed my laptop shut, stared into the middle distance, and whispered, "That's it. I'm recording her." But the truth is, it didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt like survival. I'd been gaslighted before, by people much closer to me than a boss. I knew the signs, even if I still struggled to trust them. The quiet rewriting of history. The calculated ambiguity. The subtle undermining delivered with a smile. But knowing it's happening and feeling entitled to act on that knowledge are two very different things. Especially when you've spent years being told your perceptions are probably flawed. That you're too sensitive. That you're making it bigger than it is. Even now, even with the spreadsheet debacle fresh in my mind and the HR email looming over me like a fog, I still hesitated. What if I was overreacting? What if this blew up and I looked unhinged? What if the act of recording her made me the bad guy? But I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach anymore, the one that had been tightening for weeks. It wasn't just anxiety. It was the slow build of alarm. And somewhere beneath it, a voice I hadn't heard clearly in a long time. You're not crazy. You're being cornered. So I charged my phone. I made sure the battery was full. I cleared space in my voice memos app. And the next time Melinda scheduled a quick sync, I pressed record. The meeting started like most of them did, pleasant, casual, coded in vague concern. Melinda asked how I was doing, but not in a way that suggested she actually wanted to know. She complimented something benign, a recent client summary or the font I'd used in a slide deck. And then, like clockwork, she slid into performance mode. She referenced ongoing patterns. She said she'd noticed a dip in clarity. She hinted that certain people had raised concerns about my communication style, but again, no names, no examples. Just a fog of professional-sounding suspicion. And then she said something that shifted the ground beneath me completely. She said she was starting to worry about my stability. Not my performance. Not my responsiveness. My stability. That word lodged somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. I didn't react in the moment. I just nodded. I thanked her for the feedback. I said I'd take it seriously. I performed the version of myself that made people feel safe, even while a quiet storm built in my chest. After the meeting, I sat in the bathroom stall and listened to the recording on my phone. Not once. Twice. 3 times. She hadn't just gaslit me. She had laid the groundwork to frame me as the problem. If things escalated, she could paint herself as concerned, proactive, responsible, and me as reactive, unpredictable, unstable. It wasn't slander. It was strategy. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to buying into it all. How many times I'd nearly apologized for things that weren't my fault. How many mornings I'd woken up anxious, wondering what version of the story Melinda would be telling next. I thought about how long I'd been shrinking inside of myself, trying to stay small enough not to provoke her disapproval. And I thought about my mother. How she used to say, "I'm just worried about you," in that same clipped, smiling tone, usually after accusing me of being selfish, or dramatic, or ungrateful. How concern had always been used like a leash. A way to make me question whether my pain was real or just another failure to meet her expectations. I wasn't reliving old trauma metaphorically anymore. I was in it, just in a blazer instead of pajamas, in a conference room instead of a kitchen. That realization hurt more than anything Melinda had said, because it meant I hadn't outrun the past. I just learned to dress it up and pretend it was feedback. The next day, I did something that felt simultaneously brave and nauseating. I sent the recording to HR. I didn't frame it as an accusation. I didn't storm into anyone's office demanding justice. I wrote a careful, respectful email explaining that I was concerned about how my recent interactions with Melinda might be perceived, and that I felt the need to clarify what had actually been said. I attached the file. I said I wanted to work in good faith, that I wanted transparency. That was the first time I realized how much I'd internalized the idea that defending yourself makes you difficult, that drawing a line makes you dramatic, that asking to be believed makes you dangerous. But I sent it anyway. And then I waited. To HR's credit, they responded quickly. They acknowledged receipt. They said they'd be reviewing the situation and would loop back in soon. No apologies. No outrage. Just professionalism. But the next time I logged into our team project dashboard, my name had been quietly removed from several shared files. A few days later, I was informed I'd be moving to a different team to reduce friction and support focus. There was no mention of wrongdoing. Just a clean, corporate reshuffling, like sweeping broken glass under a rug. Melinda stayed in her role. As far as I know, she was never formally disciplined. But she stopped communicating with me entirely. And just like that, the air in the office changed. No one said anything directly, but people noticed. The Slack tone shifted. I got more space, fewer check-ins, more silence, but this time, it felt like relief. I didn't feel victorious, not even close. I felt sad, not just because I'd been put through a months-long emotional obstacle course, but because I'd once liked Melinda. I'd trusted her. I'd laughed at her weird jokes and felt proud when she praised me. I genuinely believed she had my back. And now here I was, feeling like the villain in someone else's story, just because I finally chose to believe mine. The funny thing about corporate conflict is that it rarely ends with a bang. There's no big scene, no official verdict. No one announces who is right and who is wrong. HR doesn't throw confetti when you submit evidence of being gaslit. There's just paperwork, reassignments, a polite email thread that ends with, "Thanks for your understanding." I wasn't fired. I wasn't reprimanded. I was quietly moved to a different team with a different manager in a different department. My projects shifted. My calendar emptied. My stress level dropped. There was no formal debrief, no mediation. Just a new Slack channel, a welcome message, and an unspoken expectation to move forward. Melinda stayed in her role, or at least in some version of it. I don't know the details. I heard she was restructured into a more back-end position, less client-facing, less people-focused. I'd catch occasional glimpses of her name in company-wide emails or tagged in a task board, but our paths never crossed again. She never reached out. I didn't expect her to. And just like that, our weird, lopsided power dance was over. You'd think I would have felt vindicated, or relieved. And in some ways, I did. The pressure in my chest finally eased. I stopped obsessively checking my email for passive-aggressive feedback. I started sleeping through the night again. I could eat lunch without feeling like I needed to document it in triplicate. But mostly, I felt hollow. I hadn't wanted a victory. I'd wanted a different version of the story. One where this didn't happen. One where Melinda stayed the mentor she first appeared to be. One where I didn't have to defend my reality to keep my job. One where everything stayed professional, straightforward, rational. Instead, I got the kind of story you only really tell in private, if at all. The kind of story you share over a drink with someone you trust, voice lowered, the ending delivered with a resigned shrug. Anyway, yeah. So I had to record my boss. It doesn't make you look heroic. It makes you look paranoid, or petty, or just incredibly unlucky. But more than anything, it makes you look complicated. And people don't like complicated stories. I kept my head down in the new role. My new manager was decent, quiet, focused, the kind of person who says good job once a week and otherwise lets you work. There were no games, no loaded compliments, no energy check emails. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. But the adjustment wasn't immediate. My nervous system still expected danger. I found myself flinching at calendar invites, rereading messages for tone, rehearsing simple questions like they were courtroom cross-examinations. I didn't trust ease. I didn't trust being unobserved. I had been conditioned, over time, to expect surveillance, even when it was just imagined. That's what psychological manipulation does. It doesn't just bruise you. It rewires you. And it takes time to unwind the damage. What stayed with me more than anything, though, was the grief. Not for the job itself, or the missed promotion I'd probably derailed by becoming a situation, but for the relationship I thought I had with Melinda, for how much I trusted her, for the fact that, even when she was undermining me, I still wanted her approval. There's something deeply disorienting about realizing someone who once made you feel seen was only ever interested in a version of you that served them. It makes you doubt not just them, but yourself. Your instincts. Your judgment. How had I not noticed sooner? Why did I keep giving her the benefit of the doubt? Would I do it again? The answer to that last question is maybe the hardest to admit. Probably. Because even after everything, I still hesitate to name what happened too plainly. I still instinctively soften the language when I talk about it. I still ask myself if maybe I could have handled it better. Been clearer. Been more assertive. Less sensitive. That's the trick of it. When someone distorts your reality subtly enough, you carry the distortion long after they're gone. You start doing the work of doubting yourself on their behalf. Even now, I catch myself framing the whole thing as a conflict, as if we were both equally involved, equally flawed, equally responsible. But we weren't. And the recording proved that. Not just to HR. Not even just to Melinda. It proved it to me. I don't listen to it anymore. I deleted it a few months ago, in a burst of symbolic closure that felt more satisfying than it probably should have. I no longer need the evidence. What I needed, I got. A clean break. A return to reality. A reminder that my instincts are not the enemy. But I also don't pretend it didn't matter. It changed how I show up at work. It changed how I approach authority. It changed how I define respect and what I'm willing to tolerate in the name of harmony. I'm not more cynical now, but I am more careful with my loyalty. I still believe in good people. I just know not to confuse charisma with character anymore. Melinda was never the villain of her own story. I'm sure she had reasons, stressors, insecurities. I'm sure she told herself she was doing her best, that she was managing a difficult employee, that she was being proactive. And maybe that's what haunts me the most. Not her malice, but her belief in her own goodness. Because people who think they're being fair are often the hardest ones to protect yourself from. The strange thing about standing up for yourself, especially after years of not doing it, is how lonely it can feel afterward. I didn't expect that. I thought I'd feel stronger, empowered, proud, and I do sometimes. But the pride doesn't always come with a sense of victory. More often, it comes with a kind of quiet exhaustion. Like I finally carried something heavy up a flight of stairs and set it down in an empty room. Because the truth is, setting a boundary doesn't guarantee relief. Sometimes it just marks the beginning of a new kind of solitude, the kind where you finally choose not to perform, not to please, not to keep the peace at your own expense. And then you sit with that choice, alone, hoping it was the right one. That's the part no one warns you about. I've had months now to think about what happened. About Melinda. About the recording. About the ways I've shaped my personality around survival. I've tried to piece together how a stolen sandwich turned into a personal reckoning I couldn't avoid. Because that's what it was. The conflict itself was small, stupid, even absurd on the surface. But it cracked something open. It made me realize how quickly I abandon my own experience when someone challenges it with enough confidence. How hard it is for me to trust myself in the face of authority. How often I default to, maybe I'm overreacting, before I even finish feeling anything at all. I used to think trauma was just something you got over. Something you talked about enough in therapy that it stopped showing up in your day-to-day life. But it's not like that. It's quieter, trickier. It sneaks in through the back door, disguised as your tone in an email, or the way you say sorry, just checking in a Slack message. It shows up in the way your stomach drops when your calendar pings with a surprise one, or the way you rehearse a question 3 times before asking it. It lives in your reflexes, your word choices, your willingness to endure. Melinda didn't create that in me, but she triggered it so precisely, it felt personal. And for a while, I believed it was personal. I thought maybe she didn't like me, or that I'd done something to lose her trust. But now I think it was simpler than that. I think she saw what I was trained to be and used it. There's something about people pleases that makes us attractive to certain kinds of authority figures. We're malleable, eager. We make things easy. We don't ask too many questions. We take feedback well, so well, in fact, that it doesn't always matter if it's true. We'll internalize it anyway. We'll try harder, stay later, say thank you for the opportunity to fix ourselves. And in toxic systems, that's not just tolerated, it's rewarded. It's part of what kept me stuck for so long. I was praised for being adaptable, for being a team player, for being calm under pressure. But what I was really doing was dissociating in real time. Shrinking. Numbing. Editing myself down to the safest possible version. And the safer I became, the more dangerous it felt to speak up. Recording Melinda felt like crossing a moral line I'd spent my whole life trying not to approach. I was raised to believe that loyalty was the highest virtue. That private matters should stay private. That talking back, especially to someone in charge, meant you were difficult, disrespectful, wrong. But here's the thing about loyalty. When it's one-sided, it's just self-betrayal with better branding. I still think about how things might have gone differently. What if I confronted her earlier? What if I'd asked more direct questions? What if I'd stood up for myself the first time she twisted a conversation into something it wasn't? Would she have backed off? Would it have escalated faster? Would I have learned this lesson more gently? There's no way to know. All I know is that it took what it took. And that sometimes, the clearest proof you can get is hearing your own voice quietly recording the moment someone tries to erase it. I'm not proud that I had to do that. But I'm not ashamed, either. It's just what happened. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be the difficult one. The disruptor. The person who asks questions, who draws lines, who doesn't smile through a quiet dismantling of their own confidence. I used to believe those people were the problem. That if someone was hard to work with, they must be flawed. But now I think, maybe they're just unwilling to disappear. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's courage. I still don't love conflict. I still apologize too much. I still over-explain myself sometimes. And I still walk away from conversations replaying them like courtroom transcripts. But something has shifted. I don't want to be invisible anymore. This whole experience didn't make me fearless. It made me responsible for myself, my boundaries, my truth. It reminded me that being the good one isn't always good for you. That protecting someone else's comfort at the cost of your own reality is just another form of quiet self-destruction. And that sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance, pressing record, speaking up, not backing down, are the ones that change everything. So I'll leave you with this. Was I wrong for recording her? For drawing a line in a way that felt secretive, even shady, because I didn't think anyone would believe me otherwise? Was I choosing clarity or revenge? Truth or just a different story to feel safe in? I still don't know. But maybe you do. What would you have done?